They told you it was an accident. They told you it was nature. They told you that the greatest ship ever built, the unsinkable Titanic, was simply defeated by an iceberg in the middle of the North Atlantic. For over 100 years, this has been the accepted history. It is the story written in textbooks, the story shown in blockbuster movies, and the story the world has come to believe as absolute fact. But what if I told you that the sinking of the Titanic wasn't a tragedy of nature, but a calculated consolidation of power? What if the ice didn't kill the passengers, but a boardroom decision made thousands of miles away did? To understand the real story of the Titanic, you cannot look at the ice. You cannot look at the ship. You have to look at the money. You have to look at who lived, who died, and specifically, what happened exactly 1 year, 8 months, and 9 days after the ship went down. Because when the Titanic sank, it took with it the last obstacles to a financial enslaved system that rules your life today. The ship didn't just carry passengers, it carried the fate of the American economy. And when it hit the bottom of the ocean, the path was finally cleared for the creation of the creature from Jekyll Island, the Federal Reserve. This is not a story about a boat. This is the story of how the world was sold into debt and the cold-blooded assassination that made it possible. Part 1. The Morgan Empire and the Panic. To understand the assassination, we must first understand the motive. And the motive begins 5 years before the launch of the Titanic in the panic-stricken streets of New York City, 1907. The Panic of 1907 was a financial apocalypse. The New York Stock Exchange had fallen 50% from its peak. Runs on banks were happening daily. Trust companies were collapsing. The United States government, at this time, had no central bank to bail them out. They had no mechanism to print money out of thin air. The currency was backed by gold, which meant reality could not be faked. If the money wasn't there, the banks closed. In this chaos, one man stepped forward as the savior, J.P. Morgan. Morgan was not just a banker. He was the Jupiter of Wall Street. He was a man with a nose like a bulbous warning sign and eyes that could stare down kings. During the panic, Morgan locked the leading bankers in his library, refused to let them leave, and forced them to pool their funds to prop up the weak banks. He single-handedly saved the American economy. But J.P. Morgan was not a charitable man. He was a monopolist. And the Panic of 1907 taught him and his associates, the Rockefellers, the Warburgs, and the Rothschilds in Europe, a valuable lesson. They realized that if they didn't control the currency supply, their empires were vulnerable to the unpredictable waves of the free market. They didn't want a free market. They wanted a guaranteed market. They needed a central bank, a private entity masquerading as a government branch that could control inflation, interest rates, and the very value of money itself. With a central bank, they could loan money to the U.S. government at interest, effectively enslaving the taxpayer forever. But there was a problem, a massive, immovable object standing in their way. The American public hated the idea of a central bank. They remembered the warnings of the Founding Fathers. They knew that a central bank meant the concentration of power in the hands of the unelected few. But public opinion could be managed. The real problem was the opposition from the old money. There were men in America who were so wealthy, so powerful, and so principled in the old ways of hard money and gold that their influence could block the legislation in Congress. These men believed that money should be backed by gold, not by debt. They were the titans of the Gilded Age. 3 men in particular stood as the guardians of the old republic: Jacob Astor IV, Isidor Straus, Benjamin Guggenheim. Keep those names in your mind. They are not just victims of a shipwreck. They were the obstacles to the Federal Reserve. Part 2. The Secret of Jekyll Island. While the public was distracted, the plan for the takeover began in total secrecy. In November 1910, a private train car left New Jersey. The blinds were drawn. The passengers were told to use only their first names. If asked, they were going on a duck hunting trip. On board were the most powerful financial minds in the world: Paul Warburg, representing the Rothschilds; Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank; Henry Davison, a senior partner of J.P. Morgan; and Senator Nelson Aldrich, the political arm of the operation. They traveled to Jekyll Island, an exclusive club off the coast of Georgia, owned by J.P. Morgan and his associates. For 9 days, they drafted the Aldrich Plan, which would later be renamed the Federal Reserve Act. This was the blueprint for the modern financial system, a system where money is debt, a system where the bank creates money, lends it to the government, and the people pay the interest through income tax. It was the ultimate wealth transfer mechanism, but they knew they couldn't pass it yet. The political climate wasn't right, and the opposition, Astor, Straus, and Guggenheim, was too strong. These 3 men commanded combined wealth that, adjusted for inflation, would dwarf the net worth of modern tech billionaires. Astor alone was one of the richest men on the planet. Their influence in Washington was immense. If they decided to fund a campaign against the central bank, or use their media connections to expose the scheme, the Federal Reserve Act would die on the floor of the Senate. The bankers needed a way to remove the opposition. They couldn't just shoot them in the street. That would create martyrs. They needed an accident, A tragedy so great that the deaths of 3 Titans would be just a footnote in a larger list of casualties. They needed a mousetrap, and J.P. Morgan had just finished building the biggest one the world had ever seen. Part 3, the Floating Palace. Enter the White Star Line. The shipping company was owned by the International Mercantile Marine Co., a trust owned by, you guessed it, J.P. Morgan. Morgan had commissioned the construction of 3 superliners, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. These ships were marvels of engineering designed to dominate the Atlantic route. But there is a theory, supported by forensic evidence and insurance records, that the ship we know as the Titanic was actually a broken vessel from the start. Months before the Titanic's voyage, its sister ship, the Olympic, had collided with a British warship, the HMS Hawke. The Olympic suffered massive structural damage. The keel was twisted. The propeller was wrecked. In a court of law, the White Star Line was found at fault, meaning the insurance wouldn't pay out. Morgan was staring at a massive financial loss. He had a broken ship that couldn't sail and would cost millions to fix, unless he could swap them. The theory suggests that the damaged Olympic was patched up, given a fresh coat of paint, and labeled Titanic. The plan was simple: sail the damaged ship into the Atlantic, stage a controlled accident, sink it, and claim the insurance money for a brand new vessel. But the plan evolved. It became about more than just insurance fraud. It became the perfect opportunity to clean the chessboard. J.P. Morgan personally invited the elite of the world to the maiden voyage. It was the social event of the decade. Astor, returning from his honeymoon. Guggenheim, traveling with his mistress. Straus, the owner of Macy's, returning from Europe. They all booked passage. They all walked up the gangway, surrounded by luxury, believing they were stepping onto a miracle of human achievement. They didn't know they were stepping into a cage. Part 4, the anomalies. The behavior of J.P. Morgan in the days leading up to the launch is the first smoking gun. Morgan was booked on the Titanic. He had his own private suite, a marvel of luxury with its own promenade deck. His luggage was already on board. And then at the very last second, he canceled. The official excuse was that he was feeling ill. He needed to take the waters at a French spa. Yet, witnesses reported seeing him perfectly healthy, enjoying time with his mistress in France days after the ship sailed. He didn't just remove himself. He had his 7 bronze statues, which he treasured, removed from the cargo hold hours before departure. Morgan wasn't the only one. Henry Clay Frick, a steel baron and associate, canceled. Milton Hershey, of Hershey Chocolate, canceled. The Vanderbilt family, closely tied to the Morgan interests, canceled. It was as if the in-crowd knew something the others didn't. The rats were leaving the ship before it even left the dock. But Astor, Straus, and Guggenheim remained. They were not part of the inner circle of the Jekyll Island conspirators. They were the targets. The voyage itself was riddled with decisions that defy logic, unless viewed through the lens of intentional sabotage. The captain of the Titanic was Edward Smith. He was the most experienced sea captain in the world. He was a commodore of the White Star Line. He knew the Atlantic better than the back of his hand. This was to be his retirement run. Captain Smith was a Jesuit temporal coadjutor, according to some historical theories, a man bound by oath to serve the hierarchy. Whether or not you believe the religious angle, his actions were suicidal. The Titanic was warned of icebergs, not once, not twice, 6 times. Other ships in the area had stopped for the night, terrified of the ice field. The Californian, a nearby ship, radioed, "We are stopped and surrounded by ice." What did Captain Smith do? Did he slow down? Did he change course? No. He ordered the ship to proceed at full speed. 22 knots into a pitch-black night, through a known minefield of ice with the binoculars missing from the crow's nest. Why would the most experienced captain in history drive a ship like a race car through an obstacle course, unless he was under orders to ensure a disaster occurred? There were not enough lifeboats. We know this. But the regulation of the time only required lifeboats based on the tonnage of the ship, not the number of passengers. The Board of Trade, dominated by Morgan's interests, had ensured the regulations stayed lax. Morgan knew the ship didn't have enough boats. He knew that if the ship went down, thousands would die. And he knew exactly who would be left on deck when the women and children first order was given. Part 5. The Execution. April 14th, 1912, 11:40 p.m. The collision. Whether it was an iceberg or something else, the damage was done. The watertight compartments began to flood. The design of the ship, which allowed water to spill over the top of the bulkheads like an ice cube tray, sealed its fate. As the chaos unfolded, the character of the men on board became clear. And this is where the conspiracy turns into a cold reality. The crew was ordered to prioritize women and children. This social norm was the mechanism of the assassination. The men, Astor, Guggenheim, Straus, were gentlemen of the Edwardian era. They would not fight for a seat on a boat while women remained on deck. John Jacob Astor IV asked to accompany his pregnant wife to the lifeboat. He was denied. He stepped back, lit a cigarette, and tossed his gloves to his wife, saying, "I'll see you in New York." He likely knew, in that moment, that his wealth could not save him. Benjamin Guggenheim, realizing the situation was hopeless, returned to his room. He took off his survival gear and put on his evening wear. He famously said, "We are dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." Isidor Straus was offered a seat because of his age. He refused to go before the younger men. His wife, Ida, refused to leave him. They sat on deck chairs, holding hands as the water rose. These were the men who stood in the way of the Federal Reserve. And as the Atlantic Ocean swallowed them whole, the opposition to the central bankers drowned with them. And 500 souls were lost that night. The world mourned. The headlines screamed tragedy. But in the boardrooms of London and New York, the mood was different. The path was clear. Part 6, the aftermath and the act. In the wake of the disaster, the media, largely controlled by J.P. Morgan interests, spun the narrative. It was an act of God. It was hubris. It was a failure of safety regulations. They never discussed the financial implications. With Astor, Straus, and Guggenheim dead, the vast fortunes they controlled were tied up in probate and inheritance. Their political influence evaporated overnight. The terrified public was now demanding safety, stability, and protection. The bankers used the fear. They argued that the world was dangerous and unpredictable, and that strong central control was needed, not just in shipping, but in banking. December 1913, just 20 months after the Titanic sank. Congress was preparing for the Christmas recess. Most senators had already left Washington to be with their families. The opposition was scattered. The watchdogs were dead. On December 23, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was voted on. It was pushed through in the dead of night, under suspicious procedural circumstances. Woodrow Wilson, who had been supported by the bankers during his election, signed it into law immediately. The coup was complete. The United States was no longer a free market. It was a hostage of the Federal Reserve System. The power to print money was handed over to a private corporation owned by the very banks that Morgan and his friends controlled. In his later years, Woodrow Wilson reportedly regretted his decision, stating, "I'm a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is privately concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men." But the regret came too late. The trap had snapped shut. Part 7. The cycle repeats. Why does this story matter today? Why dig up the grave of a ship that sank a century ago? Because the system they built on the back of that tragedy is reaching its end game right now. The Federal Reserve was created to stabilize the economy. Yet, since its creation, the US dollar has lost 98% of its value. We have seen the Great Depression, the stagflation of the 70s, the dot-com bubble, the 2008 housing crash, and the current inflationary crisis. The system wasn't designed to stabilize the economy for you. It was designed to stabilize the power of the banks. It was designed to transfer wealth from the workers to the asset holders. The Titanic was a metaphor for the American economy. A massive, luxurious, seemingly unsinkable vessel, driven at full speed into disaster by captains who know exactly what they're doing. Think about today. Who were the Astors and Guggenheims of our time? Who were the people being silenced, debanked, or removed because they oppose the new digital financial system? We are seeing the implementation of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. This is the final step of the plan that started on Jekyll Island. The total control of every transaction, every savings account, and every purchase. Just like in 1912, there are warning signs everywhere. The icebergs are visible. The national debt is vertical. The bond market is flashing red. The banks are insolvent. And just like in 1912, the elites are quietly heading for the lifeboats. Look at the CEO stock sales. Look at the billionaires building bunkers in New Zealand and Hawaii. Look at the gold accumulation by central banks in the East. They are selling their stocks. They are getting off the ship. And they are telling you to stay on board, to keep buying the dip, to trust the unsinkable market. They canceled their trip. You're still in steerage. Part 8. The verdict. Was the Titanic sunk on purpose? We may never find a document explicitly ordering the hit. Men like J.P. Morgan didn't write down their crimes. They whispered them in cigar-filled rooms. But in the world of high finance, there are no coincidences. There are only probabilities and profits. The probability of the three most powerful opponents of the Federal Reserve dying on the same day, on a ship owned by the architect of the Federal Reserve, just months before the vote, is statistically impossible. It was a cold, calculated sacrifice. Why does 500 people were collateral damage to secure a monopoly that has extracted trillions of dollars from the American people? The ice didn't destroy the future of America. The Federal Reserve did. The Titanic was just the baptism of the New World Order. So the next time you look at a dollar bill or watch the news tell you that the banking system is safe, remember the Titanic. Remember that the band played music while the ship went down, just to keep the passengers calm until it was too late to panic. The music is playing again, the ship is taking on water, and the lifeboats are already gone. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And if you listen closely to the rhythm of the markets today, you can hear the same song that was playing in the North Atlantic in 1912. Don't be left on the deck.